What is up, Player Profiler Nation? Seth Dewald here to give you 7 early Dynasty buys that are going to help change your fortunes in 2024 if you miss the playoffs, or just bolster that championship caliber team to make it even more of a super team. So we're here to help your Dynasty teams today with 7 early Dynasty buys. Here we go. The first player we are going to talk about is Marquise Brown. The wild card in this whole situation is the fact that Marquise Brown is actually scheduled to be an unrestricted free agent in 2024. I'm guessing since they traded a first-round pick for him, you would logically think, oh, they're going to re-sign him. But wait a second, that was Steve Keim that traded a first-round pick for Marquise Brown, not the new general manager, not the new sheriff in town, Monty Austin-Fort. He could be playing for the Cardinals. He could not be playing for the Cardinals. Kyler Murray could be there. Kyler Murray might not be there. We don't know. So there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding Marquise Brown, but I'm willing to buy into the talent no matter where he goes. I think that Marquise Brown is a really good player. He should have had a better fantasy season this year, and I'll talk about that. He's still just 26 years old. He's a speed receiver that can win down the field. He still runs a 4.32 40, and additionally, Brown's season should have been much better. He ranked number 27 amongst wide receivers in target share, number 14 in air yards, number 12 in deep targets. The problem was the catchable target rate for Brown ranked number 95 amongst wide receivers. That's simply awful. And according to expected fantasy points per game metric, Brown should have scored closer to 16.5 fantasy points per game, which would have ranked him as the wide receiver 19 in fantasy points per game. Currently, Brown sits at the wide receiver 41 spot and the wide receiver 50 in fantasy points per game. So he should have been much better in 2023, and I think he's going to be better in 2024. George Pickens is next up. And while George Pickens is going to be playing for the Pittsburgh Steelers for a long time, he simply has too much talent to not succeed. I'm willing to make a bet on that talent, and coming into the season, it was believed by most fantasy gamers that the Steelers had a promising up-and-coming offense, and unfortunately, Kenny Pickett let us all down and regressed. But Pickens has yet to turn 23 years old, and he ranked number 23 in air yards, number 20 in unrealized air yards, number 14 in deep targets, number 28 in yards after the catch, and number 23 in ADOT through 15 weeks. His yards per reception mark of 15.7 ranks number 17 amongst wide receivers, and his catchable target rate of 70.2% ranks number 52 amongst wide receivers. All of these metrics point to the fact that there is a lot of meat left on the bone when it comes to George Pickens. George Pickens should have been better in 2023, and this is evident in his expected fantasy points per game metric, which puts him at 13.7 fantasy points per game. And through 15 weeks of the NFL season, Pickens ranked as the wide receiver 35 and the wide receiver 45 in fantasy points per game, averaging 10.9 fantasy points scored per week. If there's someone souring on Pickens in your leagues, I would take a chance that he turns it around in 2024. I would be hitting up those DMs. Terry McLaurin is next up. On the season, McLaurin ranks as the wide receiver 30 and the wide receiver 36 in fantasy points per game. And while the Commanders did air the ball out a lot and play from behind in negative game script situations a ton, McLaurin didn't necessarily always see the fruits of this situation. McLaurin ranked number 14 in unrealized air yards and number 17 in targets, but was hampered with a 64.6% catchable target rate, which ranked number 76 amongst wide receivers. My guess is the Commanders have a new quarterback next year as they pick near the top of the NFL draft, and their new ownership group with Magic Johnson in there is going to look to shake things up a bit with quarterback and coach. So they could trade for a quarterback too. They could add one in free agency. So this can only help McLaurin's prospects in 2024. Additionally, according to our favorite statistic, expected fantasy points per game, McLaurin ranked number 26 amongst wide receivers at 15.4 expected fantasy points per game, which is a difference of about 4 fantasy points per game. So he should have scored 4 more fantasy points per game than he did in 2023. Look for McLaurin to bounce back in 2024. Go buy him because he's not going to be as expensive as you think. Garrett Wilson is the next wide receiver on this list. And it's time to recommend buying Garrett Wilson. In the preseason, I warned fantasy gamers against drafting Wilson, especially in redraft leagues where he was being taken in the first round ahead of players like Amon-Ra St. Brown and Stephon Diggs in some cases. Now, while Wilson is still a very valuable dynasty asset, the value has come down too much, and it hasn't been Wilson's fault in the slightest. We all know that Aaron Rodgers was hurt and the quarterback play is simply terrible, so that's obviously not his fault. Wilson has yet to turn 24 years old, and while he is the wide receiver 24 on the season and the wide receiver 29 in fantasy points per game, he does rank highly in many of the metrics we care about. For example, Wilson ranks number 5 in air yards, number 5 in targets, number 5 in target share, number 5 in deep targets, and number 3 in unrealized air yards. The problem was, and always has been, quarterback play with Garrett Wilson. His catchable target rate of 67.2% ranks him as the wide receiver 66 in that category. Additionally, Wilson ranked as the wide receiver 5 in expected fantasy points per game. He should have scored closer to 21.3 fantasy points per game. That number contrasted with his 13 fantasy points per game means Wilson should have scored approximately 7.3 more fantasy points per game. And for all intents and purposes, that's an extra touchdown catch per game. And the Jets are likely going to have Aaron Rodgers in 2024, and that will be a massive improvement and ultimately will propel Wilson to at least be a top 10 wide receiver in fantasy football in 2024. Book it. Elijah Moore, come on down. It's hard to believe that Elijah Moore has yet to turn 24 years old because it feels like he's been in the NFL for at least 10 years, but he's been in the NFL for 3 seasons now. And while we haven't seen the consistent fantasy production, Moore still profiles as a wide receiver you should be interested in acquiring in 2024. Moore ranked number 12 in unrealized air yards and should have scored more fantasy points in 2023. Unfortunately, Moore was hurt by a 62.6% catchable pass rate, which ranked number 83 amongst wide receivers. And when acquiring Moore, you're banking at least somewhat on a Deshaun Watson resurgence. And I know that makes you want to puke in your mouth a little bit. To be honest, it really wouldn't take that much for Deshaun Watson to play better than he was, and he was trending in a better direction before he got injured. And I'd say this is more of a bet on the talent of Elijah Moore and his ability to get open down the field. He also won't cost nearly as much and has tremendous upside in this Cleveland Browns offense going forward. Jacobi Meyers. This evaluation is different because Meyers is actually having a pretty good season. He is currently the wide receiver 26 on the season, the wide receiver 25 in fantasy points per game. And even though the Raiders have had inconsistent quarterback play, Meyers has provided fantasy gamers value considering where he was drafted. Yet the general public still seems to be not understanding, not comprehending how good Jacobi Meyers is, because according to Keep Trade Cut, which isn't the end all be all, but gives you a little bit of a pulse of how the community values players, on Keep Trade Cut, Meyers ranks as the wide receiver 46 and the number 130 player overall in superflex formats. This doesn't make sense based on the production Meyers has put up this season. He also signed a 3-year contract in the offseason that likely secures him a spot in the Raiders wide receiving core until around 2025-2026. Meyers isn't a sexy pick, but he has proved to be a productive player, so you need to take advantage of a fantasy gamer looking to sell high or underestimating Meyers' value and get a nice depth piece or a potential wide receiver 3 if you play in a deep wide receiver format on your roster for the next 2 to 3 seasons, who could potentially have a blow-up game like we've seen this season already. So go get Jacobi Meyers, please. And last but not least, we are going to talk about the toast of London. I'm talking about Drake London. Sometimes you have to run into a burning building, as my friend Alan Seslowski likes to say. Sometimes you have to take risks. Don't literally run into a burning building, please.
Wait a second.
That's a metaphor. Sometimes you have to take risks in order to get ahead, and this is true in life, and this is true in Dynasty, and this is a calculated risk that fantasy gamers should take. You should trade for Drake London this offseason, but This depends on a couple of factors. Number one, the Falcons must fire Arthur Smith for this to be a buy, because Arthur Smith has proven time and time again that you give him first round talent after first round talent. Here you go. Here's Bijan. Here's Kyle Pitts. Here's Drake London. And you know what he does? He's like, well, I'd prefer to have Tyler Algier. I'd prefer to have Deanu Smith. I'd prefer to have Cordell Patterson. Like, why do they even draft these players? The GM for the Atlanta Falcons cannot be happy with Arthur Smith. I don't understand. Let's draft you some players that you're not going to use. Okay, here you go. We want players that we're not going to use. We want talented players that our coach is never going to use. That's our plan for success. No wonder why you suck, Atlanta Falcons. Fire Arthur Smith. Get him out of there. It's not even a question. Get him out. So they got to fire Arthur Smith for this to be a buy. And I think they will. I think Arthur Smith is gone. Secondly, they have to upgrade the quarterback position. And I think they're going to do that too. I really do. I think they're probably going to draft a quarterback. Maybe they'll trade for a quarterback. I mean, Justin Fields, who knows what his situation's going to be, but that would be an upgrade for them. I think they're going to do both things. And if they do both things, fantasy gamers are going to like having Drake London on their dynasty teams in 2024. And while the metrics don't look very promising, London has flashed that upside in week 6 against Washington and in week 14 against Tampa Bay. In both of those weeks, he posted top 5 wide receiver numbers. He's still not even 23 years old, and it's not like he's been given a fair shake in this offense. So London, under a competent regime, should flourish and be a dependable wide receiver 2 with top 12 wide receiver upside. Or the Falcons could just stick with Arthur Smith, and then if they do, you should completely ignore what I just said about Drake London. I would wish him nothing but the best and send positive energy his way, because no wide receiver should be stuck with that man. All right, that is the video. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more content. We got you covered. Dynasty, 2024 NFL Draft, rookies, here on playerprofiler.com. We have it all. So subscribe now. Do it.